A brick, darkness. Then, smoke, animal hides, and someone's mother weeping over my face. The first thing I registered was the smell. Not pain, not confusion. Smell. Thick, ancient, wrong in a way I had no words for. Unwashed bodies, charred meat, wet stone, something sharp and animal underneath it all. I had never smelled anything like it in my life. Modern people don't smell like this. Even the worst of them don't come close. This was a different category entirely. I opened my eyes. Low stone ceiling, uneven, dark, with a thin thread of water running along a crack. Firelight throwing orange shadows across the rock. The air was heavy with smoke that had nowhere to go. A woman's face, centimeters from mine, was screaming. Not in terror, in joy. Her mouth wide open. Tears streaming, both hands gripping my arms so hard it hurt. She was saying something, fast and urgent, the same sounds over and over. I understood nothing. The sounds meant nothing. She was shaking my arm, and the shaking traveled up into my shoulder and my neck and my head felt like it was full of wet sand. I tried to sit up. My arms pushed against the ground, and I stopped. These were not my arms, too lean, too young. The forearms were covered in old scars and sun-darkened skin, with black under the fingernails and calluses along the palm that I had never had in my life. I had the hands of a 42-year-old architect who spent his career at a drafting table. These were the hands of someone who climbed things, dragged things, threw things. I sat up anyway. The cave tilted, 5 or 6 people around a fire, all staring at me now. Animal skins, tangled hair. One large man with a thick black beard stood slightly apart, watching without expression. A boy, maybe 11, 12, was gripping the arm of the woman who had been screaming, jumping slightly on his heels like he couldn't contain himself. I pinched my forearm, hard. The skin went white and then red, and it hurt exactly as much as it should. Not a dream. I pinched my cheek, same result. The woman reached for me again, and I stood up too fast. My legs buckled, and I caught myself on the cave wall, stone rough against my palm. She said something. The boy said something, everyone was saying something, and the sounds washed over me like water over glass. Nothing sticking, nothing making sense. I needed air. I pushed off the wall and walked toward the light. A wide opening in the rock, maybe 20 meters away. The people called after me. Didn't follow, just called. I kept moving. I stepped outside. The sky was enormous. That was the first thing. The sheer size of it, unbroken by buildings or power lines or anything human. Just open air from horizon to horizon going gold and red as the sun dropped. The ground was wrong. Soft in a way ground isn't supposed to be, ankle-high grass rippling in a wind that smelled like rain and raw earth. Then I looked at the horizon. My mind stopped. A herd of them. 20, maybe more, moving slowly across the plain in the long light. Huge, shaggy, long curved tusks catching the sunset. They moved the way things move when nothing in the world is large enough to frighten them. Mammoths. Living mammoths. The engineering part of my brain, the part that had calculated load distributions and seismic coefficients for 20 years, the part that was always running, always solving, went completely quiet for the first time I could remember. Just quiet. Just those animals on the horizon. Moving. Then the boy appeared at my shoulder. He had followed me out. He said something short, 2 syllables rising at the end. A question or a name. Then he pointed back at the cave and said more, and I turned to look at him, and I opened my mouth to say, I don't understand. I don't speak whatever you're speaking, and I understood every word. Not translated. Not processed. Just understood. The way you understand your own name when someone calls it. He had said, Where are you going? Mother is worried. Come inside. I stood very still. He said something else. You've been sleeping for 8 days. Are you hungry? I knew this language. I knew it the way I knew how to walk. It was in the body, not in the mind. Every word he said landed with full meaning, no gap between sound and sense. The language lived in the muscles and the memory of this body I was now inside. I told him, Give me a moment. He nodded and stayed beside me, quiet for once, looking out at the mammoths with me as the light faded. I found the river by sound, water moving fast over stones, somewhere below and to the left. I half slid down the bank and dropped to my knees at the edge and looked in. 18 years old. Dark hair, matted with dirt and bits of leaf. A scar cutting through the left eyebrow. Old, long-heeled. Hollow cheeks, brown skin roughened by weather. Eyes that were darker than mine had ever been. not my face. I held very still and let the reflection settle and looked at it the way I would look at a structural problem. Without emotion, just observation. This was the situation. This was the sight condition. Now inventory what you have. Body, 18 years old. Lean, strong, no chronic injuries beyond healing ribs. Fast recovery, better than 42. Language, complete, every word, every inflection. Knowledge, everything I knew before I died. Every formula, every technique, every process. Metallurgy, hydraulics, thermodynamics, agriculture, medicine, construction, all of it. Status, son of the chief. Survived a mammoth strike. That means something here. Tools. One bone knife on the hip. One hide. Nothing else. I stood up. It wasn't nothing. A bone knife and the complete technical knowledge of the 21st century in a world that hadn't invented the wheel yet. I had worked with worse constraints. I had built a 9-floor seismic-resistant complex in Yokohama on a budget that made me want to cry. I could work with this. I climbed back up the bank and walked toward the cave. They were all waiting. The woman, Runa. I knew her name now, the same way I knew the language, from some deep storage in this body, came toward me with her hands out, and I let her take my arms and look at my face, and her relief was so raw and complete that something in my chest did something unexpected. The boy Tugu pushed in beside her, talking fast, and the big bearded man, Karhan the chief, my father now, stood at the back of the group and watched with the particular stillness of a man who makes decisions. I sat down at the fire. The others settled slowly around me. Someone handed me a piece of meat on a stick, half raw, held out by fingers that hadn't been washed in what looked like weeks. I took it. I would deal with that problem tomorrow. Today I had bigger accounting to do. I looked around the fire at each face. I counted. 43 people. 21 adults. Maybe a dozen children. They were watching me with a mixture of relief and caution. The way people watch something that was broken and might not be fixed the way it was before. I had no idea what Atho had been like. I only knew what I was. But I knew this much. These were not primitives from a textbook. The woman next to Runa was laughing at something the boy said, quietly, covering her mouth. Two men near the back were having a low argument about something, gesturing. A small girl had fallen asleep against her father's leg, and he'd shifted his weight so she wouldn't slide. People. Just people. Scared of the dark, glad to be warm, relieved when someone they loved came back. I sat with that for a moment. Then I started thinking about the water they were drinking. I woke up because of the smell. Not gradually all at once, like walking into a wall. 43 people in an enclosed stone space, no ventilation worth mentioning. No one having washed in what the body's memory told me was at least a month. The smell was layered. Old sweat baked into hides, smoke that had nowhere to go, wet dog without any dog. And underneath everything something sweet and rotting that I didn't want to think about too hard. I lay still for a moment and breathed through my mouth. Then I felt the itching and sat up fast. My scalp, my neck, the seam along my shoulder where the hide sat. I scratched, and the scratching felt good for exactly 1 second, and then I needed to scratch again. I parted the hair above my ear with 2 fingers and looked. Lice. Moving. Multiple. I put my hands in my lap, and held them there, and made a decision not to think about that yet. Runa was already at the fire. She pulled a piece of meat from the coals with her bare hands, the same hands she had used to sort through hides an hour ago, the same hands that hadn't seen water in a month, and carried it to me with a smile that said, "You are alive and I am feeding you, and this is the best morning." She held it out. The meat was dark on the outside, and I could see the center was still pale. I took it. I set it back near the coals without eating it. She frowned slightly but said nothing. Across the cave, near the far wall, an old woman crouched over 2 children lying on a pile of hides. The children were maybe 4 and 6 years old. Even from here I could see the problem. They were limp, dull-eyed, the particular stillness of children who don't have the energy to be children. The old woman was burning a bundle of dried grass over them and murmuring, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling. I walked over and crouched beside her. The younger child's lips were cracked. The smell from the hides under him was specific. I looked at the fire pit, at the hands around it, at the wooden sticks used to move the meat, at the water sitting in an open gourd on the ground where anyone walking past could kick dirt into it. I knew exactly what was killing these children. Not spirits, not bad air. The same pathogen that had been killing children for 10,000 years before anyone understood why. And the delivery mechanism was standing around the fire right now, touching food with unwashed hands, completely unaware. Last winter, Runa had mentioned last night while I was half asleep. 3 children died from stomach sickness. Just stomach sickness. A completely preventable death, 3 times over. I stood up and went to find the fat. Yesterday's butchering had left a pile of unusable scraps near the cave entrance. Offcuts, connective tissue, fat nobody wanted. I took a large piece of fat and carried it to the fire, along with an empty half-gourd. Runa watched me with the expression she'd been wearing since I came back. Not quite worried, not quite convinced, reserving judgment. I pointed at the ash pile at the edge of the fire. I need some of that. She handed me a stick to scoop it with, which I took as progress. I packed ash into the gourd, added water from the river container, set it near the coals. While it heated, I went to Runa and asked her to show me the strong-smelling plants, the ones she used for cooking, for pain, for anything. She understood the question immediately and walked me to a corner of the cave where bundles of dried plants hung from a rock. She moved through them quickly, holding each one up and naming it. I picked a minty root and a bitter bark that smelled faintly medicinal, set them aside. The water with the ash had turned gray and slightly slick to the touch, lye, rough and ready. I poured it off carefully and added the fat and the crushed herbs and set the mixture back near the coals, stirring with a stick. It took close to an hour. Tugu sat beside me the entire time, watching with the focused attention of someone who suspects something interesting is about to happen and doesn't want to miss it. What came out was ugly, gray, slightly grainy, smelling of herbs and ash and animal fat. I pressed it between my fingers. It held its shape. I carried it to the river and worked it between my palms under the water. It foamed. Tugu made a sound like he'd been hit. I washed my hands thoroughly, both sides, between the fingers, up the wrist, and then dried them on a clean patch of hide and picked up a piece of raw meat and held it out to Tugu. Look at my hands. Look at them before. Look at them now. He looked. I set the meat down and scooped up a handful of dirt and showed him the contrast. He got it immediately. He grabbed for the soap. By midday, I had the whole tribe at the lake. It was half an hour's walk through open grassland, a quiet, shallow stretch of water warm from the sun. I had explained it to Karhan in the simplest terms I could manage. The children are sick because dirt goes into food. This removes the dirt. This is how we stop children dying. Karhan listened with the expression of a man who is not convinced but is willing to be shown. The children went in first because they had no choice. Their mothers carried them. Then the women, with varying degrees of complaint. Then the older hunters, one by one, following Karhan, who walked straight in without hesitation or comment, up to his waist, and stood there with his arms crossed, looking at the horizon as if he bathed in lakes every day. Dega stayed on the bank. Dega was 17, one of the better hunters, built like a young bull and apparently aware of it. He stood with his arms folded, watching the proceedings with the expression of someone who has decided in advance that this is beneath him. I walked past him into the water and said nothing. After a few minutes, I heard him come in behind me. I passed the soap around. There was not enough for everyone to do a proper job of it. I'd have to make more, a lot more. But the principle was established. Tugu scrubbed his face with manic enthusiasm and came out looking like a different person. Runa washed her hair in the shallows and sat in the sun to dry it, and for a moment she looked younger than I'd seen her. When we walked back, the air around the group was different. Still human, still real, but no longer the physical presence it had been in the cave that morning. I was about to let everyone go when 2 of the younger women turned back toward the lake, gesturing at each other, coming back tomorrow, or the day after, wanting to make it a regular thing. I called them back. They looked at me. I looked for Karhan and found him, and said it loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Once a month, not more. The body makes its own protection. Wash it away every day, and the protection goes with it. Then people get sick from things that wouldn't have touched them before. Karhan looked at me for a moment. He didn't ask me to explain the mechanism. He just said, once a month, at the lake, all of us. And that was that. 7 days later, the 2 sick children were sitting up and eating. I was at the fire shaping another batch of soap when Runa crouched beside me. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just watched my hands working. Then she said quietly, "You came back different." I kept working the mixture. Yes. She was quiet again. Then, "Different is good, I think." She got up and went back to her work, and I stayed at the fire and noted it. First real win. 2 children alive who might not have been. Soap exists now. The tribe is cleaner than it has been in its entire history. It was a small number, but I was going to need a lot of small numbers to add up to something that could keep 43 people alive through a winter I hadn't seen yet. I set the soap aside and looked at the fire. Tomorrow I was going to fix the fire. I had been watching Gorn for 40 minutes, and I was going to lose my mind. He was crouched at the center of the cave, with a fireboard across his knees, driving a hardwood stick between his palms in long downward strokes, over and over. The same motion, the same result, a faint smell of scorched wood and no flame. His forehead was wet. He'd said 3 things under his breath that I was fairly certain were the closest thing this language had to profanity. Everyone else in the cave was sitting around him in a loose ring, waiting, their breath visible in the cold morning air. This was every morning. Gorn was the firemaker. It was his function in the tribe. The thing he was known for, probably the thing his father had been known for before him. He was good at it for this time, for this method. On a dry morning with dry wood, he could have coals in 20 minutes. But this morning the wood was damp from rain that had come in through the cave entrance in the night, and 20 minutes had become 40, and Tugu was sitting against the wall with his knees pulled up, looking at the cold meat from last night with open misery. I got up and went to find him. "Come with me," I told Tugu. "Bring your knife." He was on his feet before I finished the sentence. We went into the tree line above the cave, far enough that the sound of the camp faded. I was looking for specific things. A straight dry branch about the thickness of my thumb, a flat piece of softwood, a harder piece for the base, dry moss from the sheltered side of a rock. Tugu collected what I pointed at without asking why. He was good at that, doing first, questioning later, filling in his understanding as he went. I had already decided he was the most useful person in the tribe, by a significant margin. I cut the straight branch to arm's length and notched one end, pulled a length of sinew from my belt. I'd started keeping a coil of it on me after the first day, and strung it loosely between the 2 ends of a curved branch. Bow, spindle, flat softwood board with a small depression cut into it, a pinch of dry moss beneath the board to catch the coal. "Watch," I told Tugu. I set the spindle in the depression, looped the bowstring once around it, set my palm on the top with a smooth stone to hold pressure, and drew the bow back and forth in long, steady strokes. The spindle turned. Smoke appeared in about 30 seconds. In 90 seconds, a small coal dropped into the moss, and I lifted it and blew gently until it caught flame. Tugu looked at the fire in my hands, and then at the bow, and then back at the fire, and made a sound that startled every bird within 50 meters into the sky. He grabbed my arm. He pointed at the camp. He was already running. By the time I got back, he had told everyone within earshot, and they were all standing in a half-circle waiting. I made fire again in the clearing outside the cave entrance. 90 seconds, start to finish. Someone behind me made a sound like they'd been winded. Gorn stood at the front of the group. He was a big man, maybe 50, with a gray-streaked beard and hands like slabs of hardwood. He had been making fire for this tribe for decades. He looked at the bow. He looked at me. He looked at the bow again with the expression of a man who has just been told that everything he was good at is now optional. I held it out to him. He took it, turned it over, set it up the way I had, slowly, watching his own hands. First attempt, spindle slipped. Second attempt, better. Smoke, no coal. Third attempt, coal. He cupped the moss in his hands and blew, and the flame came up, and he looked at it with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he looked up at me and said, "Again." I showed him again. He did it again, cleaner this time. By the 5th attempt, he was faster than my demonstration. By the 7th, he was doing it without thinking about the individual steps. He didn't thank me. He just started making a second bow, his hands already understanding the geometry. I left him to it. The fire problem was solved. But watching Gorn work the coals that evening, I kept looking at the fire itself, the open pit in the center of the cave, the smoke spreading across the ceiling in a flat gray layer before seeping out through cracks. The meat held over the flame on sticks while someone turned it by hand and usually either burned one side or left the center raw. We were losing most of the heat to the air. We were filling the cave with smoke every time we cooked, and the meat was cooked unevenly because there was no way to surround it with heat, only expose it to heat from one direction at a time. I knew what fixed all 3 problems. I'd seen the basic principle in textbooks about the history of construction. It predated recorded history for a reason. It worked, and it required nothing more than stone, clay, and patience. I explained it to Karhan that night. Stone box, fire inside. Small opening in front to feed it, small gap at the top to let smoke out through the cave ceiling. He listened with the expression he used for things he was willing to try but not yet willing to endorse. "Show me," he said. It took 4 days and the whole tribe. The men spent 2 days hauling flat stones up from the river, wide, roughly even slabs that could be stacked without too much gap. Runa organized the women and the older children to dig clay from the riverbank and mix it with water until it was workable, smooth enough to seal between stones and hold when it dried. Tugu carried the smallest stones and made absolutely sure everyone noticed how many trips he made. I laid out the base on the far wall of the cave, away from the sleeping area, where a natural crack in the ceiling could be widened slightly to serve as a flue. I built the walls up in courses, packing wet clay into every joint. The children passed stones up from the pile. Dega and Ruto carried the heavy ones without being asked, which I noted. The front opening, low and wide enough to feed wood through. The interior space just large enough for a decent fire with room for food above it. A flat capstone with a gap left along the back edge. The smoke would rise, hit the ceiling, and find the crack. On the morning of the fourth day, I packed the joints with a final layer of clay and let it dry through the afternoon. That evening, Runa built the first fire in it. She fed the wood in through the front opening and stepped back. The draw worked. Smoke moved up and back instead of spreading across the ceiling. The cave stayed clear. She looked up at the ceiling, then at me, then at the ceiling again. She put a piece of meat on a flat stone and slid it into the oven and set a large flat stone across the front opening. We waited. When she pulled the stone away, the smell hit everyone at the same time. Not charred, not raw. Cooked through, the juices sealed inside, steam rising from the cut surface when she split it with her knife. Tugu took the first piece and bit into it and stopped completely still with the expression of someone whose brain has interrupted normal operation to deal with unexpected information. Everyone laughed. Even Karhan. Tugu ate 3 pieces and then went looking for more. The next morning, he came back from the river, carrying a stone with both hands. A wide flat piece with a natural depression worn into the upper surface, bowl-shaped, maybe as deep as 2 fingers. He set it in front of me. "Like a cup," he said. "Look." I looked at it. I picked it up and carried it to the oven and set it on the stone inside, and poured water into the hollow from the drinking gourd. We watched it. The water began to move, then to bubble, then to roll. I added the scraps of meat and the few roots Runa had set aside from gathering, some kind of dense starchy bulb that she usually ate raw. They softened in the water. The liquid turned cloudy, and then savory smelling, and then into something that was, by any reasonable definition, soup. I ladled some into a smaller stone cup and brought it to Runa. She drank it. Her face changed. Not the surprise Tugu had shown, but something quieter and more complicated. She held the cup in both hands and drank it slowly, all of it. And when she was done, she just sat with the empty cup for a moment. I didn't understand it immediately. I thought maybe it was the taste, or the warmth. Then I looked at her mouth. At the way she had been holding her jaw slightly off-center every time she chewed, a habit I'd noticed and filed away without understanding. Her teeth. Of course, she'd been eating improperly cooked, often tough meat for decades. Every meal had cost her something. And for the first time in her life, the food had asked nothing of her at all. She looked up at me. She didn't say anything. I went back to the oven and made more soup, enough for the whole tribe, and nobody complained that it wasn't meat on a stick, and the cave that evening was full of the sound of people eating without difficulty for the first time in a very long time. I gave Tugu a stick and a flint knife and sat him down by the cave entrance in the morning light. Every piece of meat in the cave. I told him, make 1 mark for each piece, 5 marks, cross them with 1 line, then count the lines. He looked at the stick. Why not just look at the meat? Because looking at meat tells you there is meat. Marks on a stick tell you how many days it lasts. He thought about that for a moment, then took the knife and started. He was quick. He'd been practicing his own symbol system on bark since I introduced him to the concept 2 weeks ago. So the basic idea of marks representing quantities wasn't new to him. He moved through the cave counting everything. Dried strips from the last deer, the smoked fish from the river, the roots Runa had stored in the cool corner near the back wall. He came back and showed me the stick. 43 people. 9 days of food if everyone ate a full portion. Maybe 11 if we stretched it. The nearest deer herd had moved south 4 days ago. Ruto had tracked them and reported back with the particular expression of a man delivering news he wishes were different. 9 days after that, we started eating less. After that, the children started getting the look I'd seen on those 2 sick kids, the dull eyes, the stillness. I took Tugu's stick and looked at his marks. Clean, consistent, already developing into a shorthand that was entirely his own. I set it down and looked out at the plain. Karhan took 8 hunters out that afternoon. He didn't ask me to come. I wasn't a hunter yet. Not in any way these men would recognize. But I followed at the back and he didn't send me home. I watched everything. The spears were the first problem. The flint heads were tied to the shafts with twisted sinew, but the binding was wrong, wrapped rather than secured. So when the spear flexed at the moment of release, the head torqued slightly off-center. Every throw had a built-in deviation. From 20 meters, that deviation was enough to miss a standing target, as large as a deer if it moved at all. The second problem was the formation. Karhan spread the hunters in a wide arc and drove the deer toward a tree line, which was the standard method, and had probably worked adequately for generations. But there was no one on the flanks. The deer ran left, found the line open, and split around the hunters instead of through them. One deer died, a clean kill. Karhan's throw, good shot. 7 others walked away through the gap. On the way back, I counted in my head. 1 deer, maybe 40 kilos of usable meat. 2 days of food, 8 hunters, half a day. The math was not good. I said nothing. I had a different problem to solve first, and the hunters' pride was not something I could spend yet. I hadn't earned the right to tell these men how to throw a spear. But the food calculation was now urgent enough that I couldn't wait for the right moment. I needed a solution that didn't require better hunters. I needed a solution that made the hunter's skill level irrelevant. That night I sat with Karhan after the others had gone to sleep. "There's a young mammoth," I said. "I've seen it alone near the northern stream for 3 days." Karhan looked at me. "We are not enough for a mammoth. We don't need to kill it. We need it to fall." He was quiet for a moment. "Say more." It took 3 days to build, and every person in the tribe contributed something. The location chose itself once I walked the ground, a natural narrowing between 2 rock outcrops above the northern stream, with a drop on the far side. Not a cliff, but steep enough that anything running fast would have trouble stopping. The pit went in the middle of the narrowing, 3 steps wide and 3 steps long, deep enough that I stood in it, and the rim came to my chest. We dug with sharpened sticks and flat stones and hands, and we hauled the dirt out in hides and dumped it behind the rock outcrops where it wouldn't show. Then the frame. Poles cut from the tree line, laid across the pit in a grid, covered with branches, covered with leaves, covered with a thin layer of loose dirt. From above it looked like ground. Under the weight of a mammoth it would hold for about half a second. The guide walls came last, 2 rows of stakes driven into the soil, 40 paces long on each side, narrowing like a funnel toward the pit, too narrow for the mammoth to turn around in once it committed to the corridor. Wide enough at the entrance that it wouldn't look like a trap. The night before, Ruto and Dega came back from the northern stream to confirm. The young male was still there, grazing the long grass on the near bank, alone. In the morning, we went out in full force. All 43 of us. Runa carried a torch. The smallest children carried bundles of dry grass we'd prepared to throw on the flames and make them larger. Tugu had his counting stick in his belt and looked like he was going to vibrate out of his skin from excitement. Karhan divided us into 2 groups along the flanks, wide arcs on either side, far enough back to not spook the animal too early, close enough to move in fast when it started running. I took the center. The job of the center was simple: be visible, be loud, and be slightly ahead of the flanks so the animal moved away from us rather than sideways. We found the mammoth where Ruto said it would be. It was young, maybe 12 years, which meant it stood only slightly taller than a large horse, with tusks just beginning to curve. Still enormous. Still a mass of muscle and hide that could kill any of us without particularly trying. It raised its head when it saw us and made a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. I raised my arm. The flank started forward, torches high. The mammoth turned. It moved away from the fire the way any large animal moves from something it doesn't understand. Fast, in a straight line, looking for open ground ahead. The corridor of stakes was the only open ground. It went in. Once it was between the walls, it had no choice but to keep moving. The stakes were too close together to turn, too solid to push through without slowing, and behind it was fire and noise. It ran. The pit took 3 of its legs. The sound of it going down was something I will not forget. The impact. The ground shaking slightly even where I stood. The animal's call changing from alarm to something lower and more confused. It had fallen onto its side, 1 foreleg and both rear legs in the pit, unable to rise. The hunters went in fast. It was over in less than a minute. Tugu was jumping so hard he lost his counting stick in the long grass and spent 10 minutes looking for it while everyone else was celebrating. He found it eventually and held it up like he'd recovered something sacred. 500 kilograms of meat, approximately, by my count. I stood over the carcass doing the arithmetic, while the hunters were still shouting and Karhan was giving the animal the formal thanks his tradition required. 500 kilos, 43 people, more than a month of food. Except that without cold storage, which did not exist here, the meat would begin to spoil in roughly 3 days. More in this heat. We could eat as much as possible immediately, but there were physical limits to what 43 people could consume. The rest would rot, and we'd be back to 9 days of reserves by the end of the week. I'd been thinking about this problem since the moment Karhan agreed to the trap. I already knew what I was building. I pulled Runa aside and explained what I needed. Every woman in the tribe, every knife, and all the sinew cord we had. The men could do the carrying. By midday, we had the drying rack up, a frame of lashed poles 2 meters high, with horizontal crossbars every handspan. The women worked the carcass in teams, cutting the meat into long, thin strips, as uniform as possible. Thickness mattered. Too thick, and the center stayed wet. Too thin, and the strips broke when you hung them. I showed the technique once on a front section, and then let Runa supervise the rest, because she understood immediately, and her hands were faster than mine. The strips went onto the crossbars. Under the rack, I built a slow fire from green leaves and resinous branches, not enough flame to cook, enough smoke to coat the meat and drive off insects and begin the drying process. We kept the fire fed for 3 days. The strips darkened, stiffened, shrank. On the 3rd morning, I took one down and bent it. It held its shape, dry through the center, with a smell that was sharp and preserved rather than rotting. I tore off a piece and chewed it. Hard, intensely savory, slightly smoky. I chewed it for a long time because it needed a long time, and then I swallowed and held up the strip for the small audience that had gathered. Hard, I said. Doesn't rot. Lasts 3 weeks if we keep it dry. Maybe 4. Karhan took a strip and chewed it with the same evaluating expression he gave everything. He nodded once. 500 kilos fresh had become roughly 150 kilos of dried meat. Water loss, waste, the parts that didn't strip cleanly. But 150 kilos of preserved meat was 3 weeks of full rations, not 3 days of fresh meat before it turned. The calculation was completely different. Gorn, who had appointed himself master of the fire station since the bow drill lesson, immediately took over the smoking fire as his personal responsibility. He built a small windbreak around it from flat stones to keep the smoke consistent. He explained to anyone who would listen, which was the correct reason, and which also meant he now had a second domain to be proud of alongside the morning fire. I watched him adjusting the green branches on the coals with complete concentration and thought, good. A person with ownership over something useful is more reliable than a person following instructions. Tugu updated his counting stick. He added new marks, a longer section, and showed me the result with the satisfaction of an accountant who has just balanced a difficult ledger. 9 days had become 5 weeks. That was enough time to solve the next problem. The goats were gone in the morning. 3 of them, the small herd the women had been keeping near the cave entrance, feeding scraps to, gradually getting used to human presence. They'd been tied with sinew cords to a stake driven into the ground. The stake was still there. The cords were still attached to it. What was left of the cords had been chewed through, and there was blood on the rock and a drag trail leading north into the tall grass that disappeared after 30 meters. Wolves. By the width of the paw prints, a pair of them, which meant they'd been watching long enough to know the goats were there and to coordinate. I stood at the edge of the drag trail and did the accounting I'd been putting off. 3 weeks ago, a young hunter named Voss had walked out before dawn to relieve himself and hadn't come back. We'd found his sandal and a wide, flattened area in the grass where something large had been. Big cat. The print spacing suggested something the size of a leopard or larger. Voss had been 19. He'd had a younger sister who still looked at the cave entrance every morning. Before that, 2 others in the past year. One taken near the water at dusk. One killed on a solo hunt. 4 people in 12 months. Out of 43, that was close to 1 in 10. If that rate continued, within a decade, the tribe would be too small to function. A construction site in Yokohama with a 10% annual fatality rate would have been shut down by every regulatory body in Japan before the second death. Here there was no regulatory body. There was just me, and the gap between what I knew and what existed. I spent the morning walking the perimeter, 300 meters out from the cave in every direction. That was the zone I mapped in my head as I walked. I moved slowly, looking at the ground rather than the horizon. Animal trails leave signatures if you know what to read. Compressed grass that springs back slowly, scat at territorial boundaries, worn patches where something crosses regularly because the footing is good there. I found 4 main approach corridors. The cliff face on the south side was natural protection. Nothing large was coming up that way. The other 3 directions each had 1 or 2 preferred routes, where the grass was lower, the ground firmer, the sight lines clear. These were the routes the predators used because they were the routes everything used. Tugu had followed me out without asking permission, carrying a flat piece of bark and a piece of charred wood. When I stopped to study something, he crouched beside me. When I moved on, he moved on. After the 3rd stop, I realized he was making marks on the bark, not words, but a spatial diagram, a rough shape of the terrain with symbols where I stopped longest. I looked at it. What's that mark mean? He pointed to a flattened circle symbol. Place where something walks a lot. A different mark, angular. Place where the ground changes. A dot. Water. He had invented his own map notation. I looked at the bark and felt something I hadn't felt since arriving here. Genuine surprise. Keep doing that, I said. Mark everything. The snares went in first. Sinew loops on short bent branch triggers, set along the minor trails, the ones used by smaller animals. Low to the ground, hidden under leaf cover, anchored to roots. They wouldn't stop a leopard, but they'd catch what leopards ate, which would reduce how often leopards came looking near the camp. The pit traps took 2 days, 1 for each of the 3 open approach corridors, smaller than the mammoth pit, chest deep, a step and a half wide, enough to catch a large cat or a wolf. Stakes in the bottom, sharpened hardwood, fire-hardened at the tips. The same cover technique as before. Poles, branches, leaf litter, a thin scatter of dirt. The rattles were the piece I was most pleased with. I stretched sinew cord across each approach corridor at ankle height for a large animal, tied at both ends to bent branches under tension. Every meter along the cord, I hung clusters of small bones, dry seed pods, anything that would knock together and make noise. A wolf moving through at night would hit the cord. The branches would release. The bones would clatter. Not a loud sound, but distinct, different from wind, different from settling rock. The kind of sound that wakes you up when your sleeping brain is already listening for it. Tugu updated his bark map with each installation, adding his own symbols. By the end of the 2nd day, the map showed the cave at the center, the cliff edge to the south, and 3 marked zones to the north, east, and west, each with pit symbols and rattle symbols along the approach lines. He held it up and looked at it with his head tilted. Now we can see the whole territory, he said, even at night. I looked at the map. It was crude by any standard I'd worked to. It was also the most useful document this tribe had ever possessed. The rattle at the northern corridor went off 8 days later. The sound came through my sleep as exactly what I'd designed it to be, insistent, irregular, wrong enough to drag me upright before I was fully conscious. I had a torch lit, and was out of the cave in the time it took most of the tribe to sit up. The pit was 20 meters from the rattle line. I reached it and held the torch over the edge. The leopard was young, 2, maybe 3 years, not yet fully grown, which probably explained why it had been hunting near a human camp instead of finding its own proper territory. It was alive, unhurt, except for the fall, and it was producing a sound that I felt in my back teeth. Both forepaws were scrabbling at the pit wall without purchase. Its eyes in the torchlight were flat gold and absolutely furious. The tribe came up behind me in 1s and 2s. Someone made a sharp sound when they saw what was in the pit. Karhan arrived last, looked into the pit, looked at me, looked back into the pit. His expression was the same one he'd worn when the mammoth fell, the expression of a man recalibrating something internally. The hunters finished it quickly with spears from the pit edge. Clean, efficient, no one at risk. Runa got the hide. I'd told her she would before we started digging, which had made her considerably more enthusiastic about carrying dirt. She had it staked out for curing before most people had gone back to sleep. The meat went to the stew stone. Tugu added a mark to his map in the morning, a small cat symbol at the northern corridor, and stared at it with open satisfaction. Karhan found me at the fire that afternoon. He stood beside me for a moment and then said, "Good, just the one word." But Karhan was not a man who spent words he didn't mean. I spent the next 3 days teaching Dega and Rudo to make proper spear points. The technique was not complicated, but it required patience, which was the specific quality Dega had the least of. The principle was pressure flaking, using a hard-pointed tool, bone or antler, to push thin flakes off a flint core rather than striking it. Striking gave you a usable edge fast, but an unpredictable shape. Pressure gave you control, a flat symmetric triangle, thin enough to bite deep, with lateral notches near the base for secure binding. I demonstrated on a good piece of flint, working slowly, narrating each step. The finished point was a different object from what they'd been making. Balanced, almost elegant, the base notches fitting naturally against the sinew wrapping, so the head locked rather than shifted. Dega picked it up, turned it over, set it down. My father made points like he made them, he said. It worked. I didn't argue with him. I walked to the practice target, a section of bark propped against a rock, about the width of a deer's chest, and threw my spear from 15 paces. The new point hit slightly left of center and buried itself 3 fingers deep. I pulled it out, retrieved one of Dega's spears, and threw that from the same distance with the same motion. The old-style point struck flat, skipped sideways off the bark, fell in the grass. Dega looked at the target. He looked at his spear in the grass. He looked at the bark where my point had left a clean, deep hole versus the glancing mark his had made. He picked up a piece of flint and sat down. He didn't ask for the demonstration again. He watched my hands once more from close up and then started working on his own. His first attempt was rough. His second was better. He worked without speaking, his whole attention on the stone in his hands, and I left him to it because that was the only way anyone learned anything. Ruto, sitting beside him, had already produced 2 clean points and was starting on a third. Outside the cave, the rattle line sat quiet in the afternoon wind. Tugu's map was drying on a flat rock, the symbols sharp and clear in the charred wood. The next problem was already waiting. It had been waiting since the first night I looked at the cave ceiling and thought about 43 people breathing the same air all winter. We needed houses. Winter ended the way winters end here, not with a date on a calendar, but with a morning when the air smelled different, when the ground gave slightly under your feet instead of resisting, when the birds came back and were loud about it. I stood at the cave entrance and looked at what 43 people living in one space for 4 months had produced. The sleeping area was a continuous mass of hides and bodies. No separation between families, no private space of any kind. The smell had improved since the monthly washing and the soap, but it hadn't been solved. It couldn't be solved with that many people sharing that much air. 2 weeks ago, a woman named Sarah had developed a chest cough, and within 4 days, 8 other people had variations of it. The cough moved through the cave the way fire moves through dry grass. Fast, indifferent to who was in the way. The children got it worst. Beyond illness, there was the simple arithmetic of proximity. People who live pressed against each other argue about things they wouldn't notice if they had room to walk away. Karhan had spent half of winter mediating disputes that had nothing to do with resources or status, and everything to do with the fact that 2 families had been sleeping within arm's reach of each other for months and had run out of tolerance. One fight over a hide that got pulled during the night had nearly come to blows between 2 hunters who had been friends since childhood. I needed to think. I had known this for months and had been working around it, but the fundamental constraint, no space to be alone with a problem, was starting to cost me more than I could compensate for elsewhere. Everyone needed what I needed. They just didn't have the concept yet to name it. I found a large flat piece of bark and a piece of charred wood and sat down outside in the new spring light. The cave occupied a natural recess in the cliff face. Good stone above, good drainage, defensible on the south side. I wasn't abandoning it. I was adding to it. I drew the cave mouth as a rectangle in the center of the bark. Then I drew the open ground in front of it, a rough half-circle of relatively flat terrain before the slope dropped toward the river. I put small rectangles in that space, 7 of them arranged in a loose arc facing the cave entrance, 1 hut per family. 3 large for the families with children, 4 smaller for the hunters who didn't have households yet. The cave itself stays as common space, storage, bad weather shelter, the oven, the fire. But sleeping, living day to day, having an argument, and being able to close a door that moves outside. I carried the bark to Karhan. He studied it for a long time without speaking. He turned it slightly, orienting himself to the actual landscape. He looked up at the terrain, then back at the drawing. Why live in a small cave, he said, when there is a large one? In the large cave, everyone gets sick together. In separate huts, one family gets sick and the others don't. He looked at the drawing again. I could see him thinking about the winter's cough moving through the cave, about Sarah, about the children. He was a practical man. Ideology didn't interest him much. Outcomes did. Build, he said. I put the first hut up with Tugu and 2 hunters, Ruto and a quiet older man named Breck, who had been one of the better workers on the mammoth trap. I wanted to build it slowly and correctly, narrating every decision, because the point wasn't the first hut. It was everyone being able to build the second and third without me. Poles first. I cut 12 of them to even length, the height I wanted the wall, and showed Tugu how to use the plumb line before we drove a single one into the ground. A stone tied to a cord, held at the top of the pole. If the cord hangs straight and touches the pole at the base, the pole is vertical. Simple. Obvious once you see it. Something no one here had ever thought to do because no one had needed walls that didn't lean. Tugu held the plumb line while I drove the poles, checking each one. By the fourth pole he was correcting me before I asked. Little more left. And he was right both times. The poles went in a circle, each one leaning inward slightly at the top, lashed together where they met with sinew cord. The frame was rigid before we added anything to it. Rudo pushed against it with his full weight, and it moved less than he expected. He did it again, harder, and looked at me with an expression of mild scientific interest. Walls, next. Woven branches packed with grass and then faced with a layer of wet clay that would dry hard and shed water. Tugu began to make marks on his bark sheet, a diagram of the wall layers, each one labeled with his own symbol. I watched him work and said nothing. The roof was the part that mattered most. I cut longer poles and leaned them from the wall tops to a central high point, then covered them with bark sheets starting from the bottom edge and working up, each sheet overlapping the one below it by a hand's width. The same principle as the scales on a fish, as shingles on any roof in any century, water can only flow downward, so if each layer overlaps the one below, it has nowhere to go but off the edge. I showed Tugu the overlap principle with 2 bark pieces and a cup of water. He watched the water run off the joint cleanly and made a mark on his sheet, a layered symbol, each line slightly offset from the one below. When the hut was done, I crawled inside and lay on my back on the ground. The roof held. No light came through the overlaps. The air inside was still and dry and smelled of clay and cut wood rather than 43 people. Tugu crawled in after me and lay down with his arms behind his head. Better than the cave, he said. Yes, quieter. Yes. He turned his head to look at me. Are you going to teach everyone to build one? I'm going to teach everyone to build their own. It took 4 months. Not because the construction was difficult. By the 3rd hut, the basic techniques had spread through the tribe the way any useful skill spreads when people can see it working. The pace was set by available materials, by the other work that couldn't stop, by the fact that I was also making soap and tending the trap lines and teaching Dega to stop torturing Flint and start working it. I showed each building pair the techniques once, the plumb line, the overlap, the wall packing. Then I stepped back. The 2nd hut leaned slightly to the east, and the roof leaked at one corner. I pointed at the leak and asked the builders what caused it and waited while they worked it out. They found the gap in the overlap themselves and fixed it. The 3rd hut was better than the 2nd. By the 5th, I wasn't being consulted at all. I watched from a distance while 2 hunters I wouldn't have trusted with a complex task 4 months ago argued over the correct angle for their roof poles. They were both right in different ways, and they found the compromise themselves, and it worked. Tugu kept the account. 7 huts in 4 months, 3 large Karhan's family. Runa's sleeping space now expanded and private for the first time in her life, and a family with 4 children who had been the loudest source of cave conflict all winter. 4 small for the single hunters and, eventually for me. The craft notes he had been keeping since the first hut had grown into something I hadn't anticipated. He had developed symbols for vertical angle, overlap, weight bearing, water direction, the plumb line principle, the 3-4-5 triangle I had shown him for making true right angles. He had started connecting the symbols. This technique enables this outcome. This failure has this cause. It wasn't writing. It wasn't mathematics. But it was the beginning of the reasoning that leads to both. I sat with his bark sheets one evening and looked at them for a long time. He had recorded things I hadn't explicitly taught. Inferences, connections he had drawn himself from watching. One symbol I didn't recognize. I asked him what it meant. Heavy things need more poles, he said, as if this were obvious. It was obvious. He had derived it from watching load distribution without anyone explaining load distribution to him. He was 11 years old. I set the bark down and thought about what you do when the person who is going to be most important to your project is currently 11 years old and has no framework yet for how important he is. You don't tell him. You just keep giving him things to watch. Ain arrived on a morning in late summer, when the 6th hut was going up, and the settlement was beginning to look like something that had been planned rather than accumulated. She came with 2 women from her father's tribe, a formal visit, the kind that had protocols I half remembered from Atho's stored knowledge, gifts of dried fish, and a bundle of herbs, and a set of small carved figures that Tugu immediately picked up and examined from every angle. She was tall for here, with dark eyes that moved over the settlement in a way that wasn't casual. She was cataloging. I recognized the behavior because I did it myself. She watched me for most of the morning without approaching. I was working with Breck on the corner joint problem in the new hut wall. The corner was the weakest point, where 2 wall sections met, and I was showing him a diagonal brace technique that would transfer the load more cleanly. I was also explaining why it worked. which I had stopped bothering to do with most of the hunters after noticing that the explanation rarely helped the execution. With Breck, it helped. In the afternoon, she sat down across the small fire from me. "Atho didn't know about angles before," she said. "Not a question, not an accusation, an observation, precisely stated in the tone of someone who has been holding it and decided to release it cleanly rather than sideways." I looked at her. The mammoth changed me. "Mammoths kill hunters and make the others afraid," she said. "They don't usually make them better at building." Pause. "It's a strange kind of mammoth that teaches a man how to make water run off a roof." She wasn't asking me to confess to anything. She was telling me she had noticed. The difference mattered. "Something changed," I said. "I don't have better words for it than that." She looked at the huts, at the smoke rising from the cave where Gorn was tending the drying fire, at Tugu sitting cross-legged with his bark sheets in the last of the afternoon light. "The children aren't dying," she said. "2 winters ago, 4 died before the thaw. This winter, none." I said nothing. "My father says you've disturbed the spirits," she said. "He's been saying it since the water story." She stood, brushing grass from her hide. "My father is usually right about things." She looked at me directly. "He isn't right about this." She went back to the group near the cave entrance without waiting for me to respond. I sat by the fire and turned over what she'd said. She knew something was different. She had decided it was worth protecting rather than exposing. I didn't know yet what that would cost, or what she wanted in return. Problem for another day. I had 6 complete huts, 1 under construction, and a tribe that had just spent its first winter without losing a child. The next problem was already visible from where I was sitting. The dried meat reserves from the mammoth were down to 3 weeks. We needed a food source that didn't require us to chase animals across a plain. I looked at the patch of ground below the eastern slope where the wild grain grew thick every year, and nobody had ever thought to ask why. Tugu came to me in the morning with his counting stick and the expression he wore when the numbers were bad. The mammoth reserves had run out a month ago. The deer herd had moved further south than usual. Rudo had tracked them for 2 days and come back reporting that the grazing ground they normally used in midsummer was empty. The grass cropped short by something that had passed through before us. The small game traps were producing rabbits and birds, enough to keep everyone eating, but not enough to build any reserve. The foraging was good for roots and berries, but those didn't last, and they didn't satisfy the way meat did. 6 days. That was Tugu's count. 6 days of food at current portions before we started cutting rations. And cutting rations meant the children got less, and less food for children in summer meant a harder winter than we could afford. I stood at the riverbank and looked at the water. The river ran fast over the stones in the shallows, slowed and deepened toward the center where the current was smooth and dark. In the shallows, I could see the flicker of small fish moving over the pale stones. Further out, where the depth swallowed the bottom, larger shadows held position against the current with small movements of their tails. The tribe fished occasionally. When someone wading the shallows stepped close enough to a fish, they'd sometimes grab it with their hands, and this worked perhaps 1 time in 10 and produced 1 fish when it worked. It was not a system. It was luck with wet feet. There was enough food in this river to feed 43 people for the rest of the summer. It was 3 meters away and completely inaccessible by any method the tribe currently used. I went to find a suitable bone. The hook took about an hour to make properly. I started with a rib fragment from the last deer, dense, curved slightly, about the length of my thumb. I sharpened one end to a point on the grinding stone, then worked a small notch into the point facing back toward the shank. The notch was the important part. Without it, a fish could shake itself free, and all you'd catch was the moment of hope before the line went slack. With it, the point turned inside the fish's mouth and held. I tied the hook to a line of twisted plant fiber, 3 strands twisted together. Each strand twisted individually first, the whole assembly strong enough that I couldn't break it pulling straight. The line went to a straight branch, long enough to reach out over the shallows, without my shadow falling on the water. I dug in the mud near the bank until I found a larva, fat and pale, and threaded it onto the hook. Tugu appeared at my shoulder the way he always did when something unusual was happening. He watched me bait the hook with the careful face of someone who has decided to reserve judgment. "What does it do?" he asked. "The fish eats the larva. The hook catches inside. We pull the fish out." He looked at the hook. He looked at the river. His expression communicated polite skepticism with professional courtesy. He had seen enough of my ideas work that he no longer dismissed them outright, but he was clearly not convinced. I dropped the baited hook into the water near a submerged rock where I'd seen a shadow holding position and let the current take it down. We waited. 2 minutes. 3. Tugu shifted his weight. I kept the line still. The pull was unmistakable. Not a nudge, a sharp tug that traveled up the line and into my fingers. I lifted the branch in a smooth arc, and the fish came out of the water in a spray of drops, hanging and twisting on the line, catching the sun. Tugu's shout scattered every bird within 100 meters for the second time in our acquaintance. By evening, 3 teenagers had working hooks and lines and a basic understanding of where fish hold in moving water. I kept the instructions simple. Fish face into the current. Fish like shade and cover. Don't let your shadow fall upstream of where you're fishing. The first part took some demonstration. The other 2 parts they worked out themselves within an hour of sitting quietly on the bank and watching the water. The hooks themselves required practice. The notch was easy to make wrong, too shallow or at the wrong angle, and a bad notch meant lost fish. I made 10 hooks over the course of the day and had Rudo and 2 of the younger hunters copy them. By the following morning, there were another 12. Bone was not a scarce material. Every meal produced more of it. The shallow bank produced fish. Not many, not reliably, but enough that within 2 days we had supplemented the food count meaningfully. Tugu updated his stick. 6 days had become 9. Better, but the improvement was limited by the bank itself. The shallows held small fish. The deep center of the river, where the current was strong and cold, held larger ones. I could see them from the bank when the light was right. Unhurried shapes that outweighed anything we were pulling from the shallows. I needed to get to the middle of the river. I explained the concept to Karhan using a demonstration rather than a description. I floated a large piece of bark in the shallows with a stone on it and showed him that the bark held the weight without sinking. He watched it for a moment. People are not stones, he said. No, people are lighter. He looked at the river. People don't walk on water. They will, I said. On wood. He said nothing else, which I had learned was permission. The raft took 2 days and was built by the whole tribe because everyone was curious enough to involve themselves. The main logs were the thickest straight sections I could find, 6 of them, each the length of 2 men, lashed side by side with sinew cord woven through notches. I cut at each end so the binding couldn't slide. Cross-bracing underneath, 2 thinner poles perpendicular to the main logs, lashed tight. The whole structure was rigid enough that when I walked across it on dry ground, it didn't flex under my weight. We launched it at the shallow edge on a calm morning, the whole tribe on the bank to watch. It sat on the water and it floated, which produced a collective sound from the assembled observers that I found quietly satisfying. I stepped onto it. It dipped and settled. I took the long steering pole, a straight branch, smoothed, long enough to reach the bottom in moderate depth, and pushed off from the bank. The current took the stern slightly, and I corrected with the pole. The raft moved out into the river. I looked back at the bank, where 43 people were watching in complete silence, and then looked out at the deep center channel ahead. Gorn was the second person on the raft. He had appointed himself to this position on the grounds that he managed both the morning fire and the drying smoke, and therefore was clearly essential to any new food-producing operation. He stepped aboard with the confidence of a man who has decided not to be afraid of something, regardless of whether the fear is reasonable. He lasted approximately 30 seconds before the raft rocked on a small cross-current, and Gorn went sideways into the river. The splash was considerable. The river at mid-channel was cold and chest-deep, and Gorn came up fast with the expression of a man who has been deeply surprised by something he should have anticipated. He grabbed the edge of the raft, and I helped pull him back aboard, and he sat dripping in the center of the raft, looking at the water around him. From the bank came the sound of 42 people failing to suppress laughter at varying degrees of success. Gorn looked at the bank. He looked at the river. He picked up his own pole, which had somehow stayed aboard, and he planted it against the riverbed and pushed. By midday, we had 3 people on the raft working the deep channel, and we were pulling up fish that the bank fishers had never seen up close, long, heavy, silver-sided, fighting the line hard enough that landing them took real effort. By evening, the drying rack had a second generation of product. Tugu counted the day's catch and made his marks with the expression of an accountant who has just resolved a difficult problem elegantly. 30 fish. The deep channel, if we fished it consistently with 5 people, would produce that or more every day. 30 fish daily was a protein supply that could run parallel to the hunting indefinitely. Not dependent on herd migrations, not dependent on good weather, not dependent on anything except the river continuing to be a river. 6 days had become, by Tugu's revised count, something he ran out of marks for before he ran out of stick. He found a longer stick. Tugu and I had been walking the eastern territory for 2 hours when he stopped, pulled a seed head from a thick stand of grass growing in the hollow near the stream, and put it in his mouth. He chewed. His face went through several expressions in quick succession. Anticipation, effort, disappointment. Hard, he said. Tastes like dirt. Don't eat it like that." I took the seed head from him and stripped the grains off between my fingers. Small, pale, dense, wild einkorn, or something close enough that the difference didn't matter. It grew here in thick stands, chest high, the hollow full of it, probably self-seeding in the same spot for centuries because the conditions happened to be right. Tugu watched me examine the grain with the look he had developed for moments when I was thinking rather than acting. Patient, attentive, ready to be interested. I looked at the hollow, then at the flat ground above it, near the stream, then at the grain in my hand. The hunting-based food supply had a fundamental problem I hadn't fully solved. It required the animals to cooperate. Herds moved, seasons changed. A bad hunting month created a crisis. The fish helped significantly. But fish were one source, and one source was one point of failure. What was in my hand was something different. Grain didn't migrate. It didn't run from noise or disappear into valleys further south. If you put it in the right ground and gave it water, it came back every year in the same place, predictably, in quantities that scaled with the area you planted. The entire foundation of every civilization I had ever studied was built on this fact, and every one of those civilizations had discovered it by accident. I wasn't going to wait for the accident. The women were the right people to tell first. They did the gathering, roots, berries, herbs, everything that wasn't hunted. And that meant they understood plants in a way the hunters didn't. Runa was the best of them, her knowledge so thorough that she could identify anything growing within a day's walk and tell you whether it was edible, medicinal, or useless. I brought a handful of the grain back and sat with her and 3 other women outside the cave in the late afternoon. I put a grain down and covered it with a small amount of dirt and waited. "We know," Runa said. "Plants put their own seeds in the ground." "Yes, and they come back where the conditions are right. I want to choose the conditions." She was quiet for a moment, turning a grain between her fingers. "Put the seeds where we want them to grow, and give them water when there isn't enough rain." She looked at the grain. She looked at the flat ground above the eastern hollow, which she could see from where we sat. I could see her thinking through the implications in the way she thought through most things, practically without ceremony, following the logic to its conclusion. "More seeds," she said finally. "In the same place. Every year. More every year. The ground improves. The yield grows." She nodded once, the same way Karhan nodded when he had decided something. The conversation was apparently over, and the project had apparently begun. We cleared the plot in 3 days, pulled the existing vegetation, broke the surface with sharpened digging sticks, turned the soil over to a depth of roughly 2 hand widths. The ground was better than I'd expected. Dark, slightly damp from the stream's influence, with the loose texture that meant drainage worked. Runa identified 2 sections where the soil was harder and redirected those to a second plot closer to the stream, where the constant moisture would soften them over time. The children helped. Tugu organized them with the authority of someone who has decided that organization is his natural function, assigning sections and checking work with his bark sheet tucked under his arm. 2 small girls competed to see who could pull the most root clumps. A boy of about 7 moved through the cleared soil on his hands and knees removing stones, which nobody had asked him to do, and which was exactly right. We seated in rows. Runa's suggestion, based on her observation that plants with room between them grew larger than plants crowded together. She was correct, and I told her so. And she received this with the mild expression of someone who did not particularly need confirmation. A week later, the plot was dry. Not dead. The seeds were dormant and would wait. But the surface had cracked in the heat, and when I pressed my palm against the soil, it came away without moisture. The stream ran 30 meters away, too far for the ground to draw from passively, and carrying water in gourds 2 or 3 at a time would take hours every day and still not be enough. I stood at the stream bank and looked at the difference in elevation between the water surface and the field. The stream ran slightly higher than the plot, a gentle slope, maybe 2 hand widths of drop over 30 meters. Not much. Enough. I pulled Ruto and Breck away from the afternoon's work and took them into the tree line to find the right material. Straight sections of log, each about the length of 2 men, dry enough to work but not punky. We split them lengthwise with wedges and mallets, hardwood wedge driven with a heavy stone, working along the grain, each log splitting into 2 curved halves that cupped naturally. The channel of each half log I smoothed with a flint scraper, clearing the loose wood until the interior was even. Then we notched forked branches at regular intervals and drove them into the ground between the stream and the field, each fork slightly lower than the last, following the natural slope. The half logs sat in the forks, end to end, their open sides up, forming a continuous trough from the stream bank to the edge of the field. Tugu had been watching the whole assembly with his bark sheet, making notes. When I opened the small channel in the stream bank that let water in, he was standing at the field end watching for it to arrive. The water ran the full length in about 20 seconds and spilled onto the dry soil at the edge of the plot. Tugu watched it soak in. He watched the water surface in the trough for a long moment. Then he said, with the particular tone he used for things he was going to write down, "Water wants to go down." Yes. So if you put the channel above the field, the water goes to the field on its own. Yes. That's the whole idea. He made a mark on the bark. A long diagonal line representing slope, with a small vessel symbol at the high end and a field symbol at the low end, water flowing between them, his version of an arrow. He looked at the mark. "You can move water anywhere," he said, "as long as you have somewhere lower to put it." I looked at him for a moment. He was 12 years old, and he had just derived the foundational principle of hydraulic engineering from watching a wooden trough for 30 seconds. "Write that down carefully," I said. "That thought is worth keeping." The first harvest came in late autumn, and it was modest. I had told everyone it would be, which didn't fully prepare them for the reality of pulling seed heads from a plot and ending up with a pile of grain that fit inside 2 large gourds. First-year yields from unconditioned soil were always low. The soil needed seasons to develop, and we had given it one. But it was there. Tangible, countable, ours. Runa ground the grain between 2 flat stones. An upper stone worked in circles against a lower one, the grain between them slowly becoming coarse flour. She mixed the flour with water and cooked it in the stone bowl over the oven until it thickened into a pale, dense porridge. The tribe ate it in silence at first, the way people eat unfamiliar things, carefully, reserving judgment. Then Gorn ate his portion in about 4 bites, looked into his empty bowl, looked at the pot, and announced that it was better than meat. Everyone laughed. Gorn had been saying things were better than meat since the first soup. It had become the tribe's informal rating system, and he deployed it with the consistency of a man who means it every time. Runa let him have a second portion and then covered the pot. Next year the plot would be larger, and the soil would be better, and the yield would be 3 or 4 times what it was now. The year after that, more. This was the arithmetic of agriculture. Slow at first, then faster, then so fast you had a surplus, and a surplus meant you could feed people who did other things besides hunt and gather. Specialists, division of labor. The actual foundation everything else was built on. I was looking at 50 years of work, and the first year was done. 2 weeks after the harvest, 2 children came down with stomach sickness again. I had been watching for this, not as a failure, but as information. I followed the water. They drank from the river. I traced their routine and found it. They went to the bank downstream from where the women washed hides in the morning, the section of river that ran past the area we used for waste disposal before the improved latrine system I'd built in the spring. The contamination pathway was direct and completely obvious once I was looking for it. I took a large gourd with a hole punched in the bottom and packed it in layers, a base of coarse gravel from the river stones, then a thick layer of charcoal pounded from the fire pit, then fine river sand, then gravel again at the top. Water poured in at the top came out at the bottom, running clear and noticeably different in appearance from what went in. I boiled the filtered water in the stone bowl until it had rolled for a count of 200. I showed both results to the tribe at the fire that evening. The river water in one gourd, cloudy with suspended particles, and the filtered and boiled water in another, clear as the stream above the settlement. "Sickness lives in the dirty water," I said. "The stones and the fire remove it." Goro spoke from the other side of the fire without raising his eyes. "Why would you clean water that the gods gave?" I had been expecting this. I had been expecting it for weeks and had prepared accordingly. "The gods gave the river," I said, keeping my voice flat and even. "I'm making the water worthy of the chief." A pause. Then Karhan said, "Let it be so." Goro went quiet. He did not argue with Karhan in public. That was a line he hadn't crossed yet. But he was looking at me across the fire with an expression that had moved past suspicion into something more deliberate. I met his eyes for a moment and then looked back at the fire. He was not finished, I knew that. But tonight the water was clean, and the children would recover, and that was what mattered. Next year's grain plot would be twice the size of this year's. I needed to expand the irrigation trough to match, and the extension would require better joints in the channel sections. I had been thinking about clay lining for the trough interior. It would seal the wood, reduce seepage, last longer. There was always a next problem. I was beginning to understand, the entire nature of the work. Karhan's cough started the way serious illness always starts. Quietly, easily dismissed, The kind of thing a man ignores for 3 days before his body stops giving him the option. By the 4th day he had a fever that I could feel from a hand's width away, and by the 5th he was lying in his hut with wet hides over him because he was cold, which was the wrong treatment and was making everything worse. The tribe's healer, an old woman named Asa who had genuine knowledge of local plants, and also a set of beliefs about illness that were going to kill the patient if I didn't intervene, was burning dried herbs over him and preparing a bitter root infusion that smelled medicinal in the way things smell medicinal when they have no actual effect. I relieved Asa of the wet hides first, which she accepted with poor grace, and replaced them with dry ones from the storage in the cave. Then I went to the riverbank and stripped bark from the willow trees that grew in the wet ground near the water's edge, the pale inner bark, which I had been saving for exactly this kind of situation since I first identified the trees 4 months ago. I knew what was in it. Not the molecule, not the chemistry, but the effect, which had been documented in every traditional medicine system that had access to willows for the same reason. It worked. I boiled the bark in the stone bowl, let it steep until the water darkened, strained it through woven grass into a smaller vessel, and brought it to Karhan with a bowl of fish soup. He drank both without asking what they were. That was either trust or the pragmatism of a man who felt too ill to argue. I came back twice a day, changed the hides when they dampened from sweat, made sure he was drinking water, the filtered, boiled water from the gourd system, not the river, kept the fire in his hut at a steady level rather than the roaring blaze Asa preferred, which was drying the air and making his cough worse. He slept a great deal outside his hut. Things were fraying. Tugu sat at the entrance of Karhan's hut every morning with his counting stick, marking the days. He wasn't doing it for any practical reason. There was no decision the count would inform. He was doing it because counting was the thing he did when he needed to feel that something was being measured and therefore managed. I understood the impulse completely. Inside the settlement, the ordinary structure of authority had developed a gap. Karhan made the decisions that required someone to make decisions, and in his absence those decisions were going unmade or being made badly by whoever spoke loudest. 2 of the senior hunters had been arguing for 3 days about the correct route for the autumn deer search, an argument that should have taken 10 minutes and been resolved by whoever had better information, which was Ruto. Instead, it had become a question of status, which meant it could run indefinitely. Dega had started holding court near the fire in the evenings. Nothing explicit. He wasn't claiming anything. Just talking, being visible, being loud in the way that young men who are testing their reach are loud. The other hunters listened to him the way they hadn't before. I noted it and said nothing. On the 7th day, Karhan sent Tugu to find me. The hut was warm and smelled of the willow bark infusion and the particular quality of enclosed sickness. Karhan was sitting up, not fully leaning against the wall on a folded hide, but sitting. His color was better. The fever had broken the day before and hadn't returned. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You've changed," he said. His voice was still rough. "I see it. The others don't see it, or they see it and say nothing." I sat down across from him on the ground. "Yes. What did you become?" I had thought about this question for a long time. Not what answer to give. There was no accurate answer I could give him. But how much of the truth was useful? A man who believed his son had been replaced by a foreign spirit would not name that spirit as the next chief. A man who believed his son had been changed by a genuine encounter with something beyond normal understanding might. "I'm Atho," I said. But the mammoth took part of me and something else came back in its place. I don't have a name for what it is. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the settlement, and I could hear the grain field rustling on the slope below. "It doesn't matter what it's called," he said. "The tribe is alive. Children aren't dying from the water. There's meat on the racks and grain in the store, and everyone sleeps dry." He paused to breathe carefully, managing the cough. "The huts were your idea. The fish were your idea. The pit that caught the mammoth." Another pause. "My ideas kept us alive. Your ideas made us something more than alive." I said nothing. "After I die," he said, "you." It was not a question. I nodded once. He closed his eyes. "Go fix whatever Dega is doing out there." Karhan recovered slowly over the following 2 weeks, well enough to sit outside his hut in the afternoon sun, well enough to take the evening meal with the rest of the tribe, but not well enough for the kind of physical authority a chief needed when it was enforced by presence rather than words. He moved carefully. He tired quickly. He called the full assembly on a morning when the autumn light was sharp and everyone was in the settlement between tasks. All 43 people gathered in the open ground between the huts and the cave entrance, the space that had become the natural place for anything that involved the whole tribe. Karhan stood at the front, Runa beside him. He looked better than he had in weeks, which I suspected was deliberate preparation. He named me. Not with ceremony, not with a long speech. That wasn't how he operated. He said that he was naming his successor while he was alive to name him, that the tribe would know who led them before they needed leading, and that the successor was Atho. Goro stepped forward before the last word had settled. Tradition, he said, with the precision of a man who has been planning this statement. The chief dies, the tribe chooses. That is how it has always been. Karhan looked at him. The look lasted long enough that several people shifted their weight. I'm not dead, Karhan said, and I've chosen. Goro opened his mouth. Karhan's expression didn't change. Goro closed it again. Across the assembly, Dega was looking at the ground with the particular stillness of someone choosing not to let their face show what they're thinking. Rudo, standing near the back, caught my eye and offered the smallest possible version of a satisfied expression. I stood at the front of my tribe and felt the weight of what had just happened settle across my shoulders. In the body I was wearing, 19 years old, a young hunter still building the calluses of adulthood, whose father had just given him something that should have come in another decade. In the mind I had brought with me, 62, an architect who had spent a career managing large projects and larger problems, who had died on a construction site and woken up here, and who had now been handed the formal responsibility for 43 lives in a world that wanted to kill all of them. Both of those things were true simultaneously. I had stopped finding that strange somewhere around the second month. Karhan sat back down. He looked tired, but satisfied. Runa brought him soup. I looked out at the tribe, looking at me, and thought, the watchtowers need to go up before winter. Goro is going to become a problem before spring. The grain plot needs to triple in size, and whoever has been leaving unfamiliar footprints on the eastern ridge for the past 2 weeks needs to be identified before they identify us. There was always a next problem. Now it was officially mine. The ash was the wrong color. I crouched over the cold fire pit at the edge of the western tree line and looked at it for a long moment before touching anything. Our tribe burned mostly hardwood from the river valley and pine from the upper slopes. The ash was pale gray, almost white when dry. This ash was darker, with a reddish tinge and a different texture, coarser. Someone had been burning oak here, or something similar. Whatever they were burning, they hadn't learned it from us. Tugu crouched beside me and looked at the ash without touching it. He was 13 now and had stopped announcing his observations out loud. He made his marks on bark and let the marks speak, but I could see him reading the site the same way I was. His eyes moving from the fire pit to the ground around it to the tree line beyond. Old, he said. 7 days, maybe 8. The grass around the pit had rebounded almost fully. He was right. I looked at the surrounding ground. The soil near the pit was compressed. Multiple people had sat here, moved around here. I found partial prints in a soft patch near the roots of a large tree. Wide, flat-soled, the ball of the foot heavier than the heel. Different gait from our hunters, who tended toward heel first from years of stalking. These people walked differently. We mapped the site on a fresh piece of bark and moved on. 4 days later, Tugu found the second camp. This one was recent. The ash was still slightly warm at the center when I pressed my palm against it, and the discarded bones nearby hadn't been touched by scavengers yet. I counted the bones. 3 deer, cleaned thoroughly, every scrap of usable meat stripped. The camp had held at least 20 people, probably more. They had eaten well here, which meant they'd had a successful hunt, which meant they were capable and organized. I was still looking at the bones when Tugu touched my arm and pointed. Half concealed under a fallen branch at the edge of the camp was another bone, longer than a deer leg. The wrong shape for any animal I recognized in this environment. I picked it up and turned it over and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of what I was looking at. Human femur. Adult. The surface marks were identical to the marks on the deer bones. The same tools, the same technique, the same thoroughness. I set it down carefully and stood up. Don't touch it, I told Tugu. He had already stepped back. We walked back to the settlement in silence. I stood on the highest point of the ridge north of the settlement and looked at the terrain. 3 hills formed a rough arc around the settlement. The ridge to the north, a lower rounded hill to the east, a rocky outcrop to the west above the tree line. From the ridgetop I could see a long way. The river to the south, the grain field, the huts, the cave entrance, the smoke from the drying fire. But I was seeing it because I was standing on bare rock at the summit. From the tree line below, at ground level, you could see perhaps 30 meters before the vegetation closed in. Whatever was moving through the western forest was doing so invisibly from our settlement. We had rattles and pit traps on the approach corridors, but those were for things coming close. I needed to see things coming from far away. with enough time to prepare rather than react. The solution was simple, and I should have built it months ago. I called Rudo and Breck and 3 of the younger hunters and took them to each of the 3 high points in sequence, explaining what I needed. The tower didn't require sophistication. It required height. 4 heavy uprights, cross-braced for stability, a platform large enough for 2 people to stand on, a ladder of horizontal rungs lashed between 2 uprights at an angle. The whole structure needed to resist wind and the weight of 2 adults moving around on it. I knew the forces involved well enough to overbuild it by a factor of 2, which meant it would last. We cut timber for 3 days and built for 4 more. The tallest tower went on the northern ridge, 6 meters of height above the summit, which put the platform 10 meters above the surrounding tree canopy. I climbed it when it was done and stood on the platform and looked out. The river. The plains beyond it. The eastern grasslands where the deer grazed in the early morning. The western forest. And beyond it, the northern territory that extended further than I had mapped. The grain field below looking small and deliberate, and ours. Tugu came up behind me on the ladder and stepped onto the platform and looked. He was quiet for several seconds. Then, Atho, I can see all the way to the river. I can see where the deer walked this morning. Good. I pointed north, into the trees. That's where we need to look. He understood immediately. He added a tower symbol to his map at each of the 3 sites, with sightline marks extending outward. We set a rotation. 2 people on each tower during daylight hours, rotating every half-day. The assignment went to the hunters who were between tasks. It wasn't physically demanding work, and it required patience rather than strength, which meant it suited different people than the hunting rotation did. Gorn volunteered immediately, citing his experience as fire monitor as evidence of his qualifications for extended stationary observation. I gave him the eastern tower. I sent Tugu and Ruto north, on the 3rd day after the towers were finished. The instruction was specific. Find where the strangers are. Count them. Watch how they move and how they make decisions. Come back. Don't approach. Don't make contact. Don't let them see you. Rudo had the best fieldcraft in the tribe. He could move through dry brush without sound in a way that still seemed improbable to me. Tugu had the best eyes and the best spatial memory. They were gone for 3 days. I ran the settlement in their absence without indicating that anything was wrong. Expanded the grain field irrigation. The second channel section needed clay lining, and I had been putting it off. Supervised the drying rack rotation. Had a long and careful conversation with Daga about the winter hunting strategy that was really a conversation about whether Daga was going to be manageable, which ended inconclusively but peacefully. On the morning of the 4th day, I was at the irrigation channel when Tugu appeared at the field edge. His bark sheet was under his arm. His face was still in the way. It only was when he was controlling it deliberately. Rudo was 2 steps behind him and was pale in the manner of someone who has seen something they are working to process into ordinary experience and finding the work difficult. I set down the clay I was working and walked over. Sit down, I said. Tell me. Rudo sat. Tugu remained standing, which he did when he was going to give a formal report, a habit he had developed on his own from somewhere I had never identified. The tribe numbered approximately 60, he said, moving from the north, following the river valley south. They were lean, not starving yet, but the kind of lean that meant the easy food was gone, and what remained required effort. They moved efficiently and quietly for a group that size, which meant organization, which meant a leadership structure that worked. Then Rudo told the part that had made him pale. At their last camp, dug into the soft ground near their fire pit, wrapped in bark, bones. Not animal bones from the current camp. Bones from before older, some of them. The shape and size of them was not ambiguous. I sat with that for a moment. 60 people, hungry, moving toward the only well-supplied settlement in their path. Our 43 had 18 people who could fight if fighting became necessary, and that number included Gorn with his bad leg and 2 hunters who were recovering from injuries. 18 against 60 was not a battle, it was a conclusion. I looked at Tugu's bark sheet. He had drawn their camp, their direction of travel, their approximate daily distance. At their current pace, they would reach the edge of our territory in 8 days. Possibly 10 if the hunting improved and they slowed to feed. 8 days. I stood up and looked at the northern tower on the ridge, where Rudo's younger brother was currently on watch, scanning the tree line. I had 8 days to come up with something better than 18 spears against 60 hungry people who had already demonstrated what they did when their options ran out. I went back to the clay lining and worked it in silence, because the hands needed something to do while the mind worked a problem that didn't have an obvious solution yet. I called the council at dawn, before the morning tasks scattered everyone across the settlement. Every adult man, seated in a half-circle in the open ground between the huts and the cave. Tugu's largest bark map laid flat on the ground at the center, weighted at the corners with stones. I had never shown the full map to the whole tribe before. There had been no reason to. Now there was. They looked at it the way people look at something they recognize but have never seen from this angle. The settlement was a cluster of small marks at the center. The 3 towers on their hills, the river to the south, the grain field marked with Tugu's grain symbol, the forest to the north, the approach corridors marked with the rattle and pit symbols from the trap system. Their entire world reduced to marks on bark, legible as a single image for the first time. I let them look for a moment. Then I told them what Tugu and Ruto had found. 60 people from the north, moving this direction. Hungry. The last part, the bones at the camp, I described plainly without elaboration. The room absorbed it in silence. Goro spoke first, as he always did when he saw an opening. There were ceremonies for times of threat, he said. Prayers to the grandfather in the mountain. Offerings before any action. He could prepare these quickly if given the morning. I looked at him. We survive first, then we thank the spirits for helping us survive, in that order. Goro sat back. Not satisfied, but calculating. Dega spoke next. We move. Take the dried meat, take the tools, go south past the river, let them have this ground. I had expected this. Take the dried meat and the tools and go where? There's no cave waiting for us south of the river. No grain field we've already planted. No fish run we've already mapped. I paused. If we leave now, we arrive at winter with no shelter and half our food. They don't kill us. The cold does. Same result. Dega looked at the map. He was thinking, not posturing. The real threat had done what I'd observed before, pushed the ambition aside, and left only the practical man underneath. Then what? He said. Then we make it so they don't want to fight us, I said. Or if they do, they can't win. I looked around the circle. We have 8 days. We use all of them. The bow I built that afternoon was not the hunting bow I'd considered making a dozen times and set aside, because we had enough food. This one was built for range and power. Longer limbs cut from the most flexible section of a yew-like tree I'd identified on the eastern slope. The grain running straight along the length, no knots in the working section. The stave needed to be thicker at the handle and taper evenly toward the tips, which required careful work with a flint scraper and a lot of patience and checking by eye. The string was 4 strands of twisted sinew, tight and even, slightly shorter than the unstrung bow, so it held the limbs under tension. I strung it and drew it twice to feel the weight, heavier than the hunting bows, requiring real effort at full draw, which was exactly what I wanted. The arrows were a separate problem. A hunting arrow could be rough and still work at close range. A war arrow needed to fly straight at distance, which meant the shaft had to be straight, the fletching had to balance the rotation, and the point had to be heavy enough to carry momentum, but not so heavy it dropped fast. I made 6 myself, working slowly, demonstrating each step. Straight shafts selected from a bundle. Tugu had spent 2 days sorting. 3 feathers split lengthwise and bound to the knock end with fine sinew, each one set at a slight angle to induce spin. A flat, pressure-flaked point with deep lateral notches, bound with sinew and sealed with pine resin. I shot the first arrow at a bark target 30 meters away. It hit where I was looking, buried the point, 2 fingers deep. I shot the second at 60 meters, the far edge of the clearing. It dropped slightly but hit the target I'd set there. The hunters watched without speaking. They had all thrown spears. They knew 15 meters was optimistic in combat conditions. Knew that a thrown spear was a one-use weapon that had to be retrieved to be used again. 60 meters of range, from a weapon you kept in your hands, that could shoot again in the time it took a man to draw breath. Ruto picked up the bow. He had watched the shooting grip carefully. He drew it, held, released. The arrow went wide but covered 50 meters. He looked at the bow in his hands with the expression I had seen on Tugu's face the first time water ran down the irrigation trough on its own. How many can we make? He said. Not a question about whether. As many as we have time for. I divided the work that evening, and it ran for 5 days without stopping. The women got the stringing and fletching, fine motor work, exacting, requiring consistency. Within half a day, it was clear they were better at it than the hunters, and by the second day they had developed a checking method of their own. Lay the finished arrow on a flat stone and roll it, reject any that wobbled. Runa supervised the quality control with the same authority she brought to the grain field. Tugu and the older children sorted shaft material, every straight branch in the settlement's territory that met the spec, stripped of bark, laid in the sun to dry and straighten. He had 3 younger boys working under him by the second day, and had assigned each one a section of the supply without being told to organize it that way. The hunters built bows under my oversight, each one taking a full day to get right. I checked every stave before stringing. A bow with bad grain, or an uneven taper would break at full draw, and a broken bow in the wrong moment was worse than no bow. We rejected 4 staves and went back for better wood twice. Dega sharpened points. He had been doing it since part 5, since the demonstration with the 2 targets, and he had developed past the technique I'd shown him into something of his own. He understood pressure flaking now at a level that was instinctive rather than learned, felt when the stone wanted to split and worked with it rather than against it. He sharpened in silence for 5 days, barely stopping, producing points of consistent quality that Runa's women bound to shafts with a speed that surprised me. On the 3rd day, I mounted a flat stone on a wooden frame, the stone's surface running on 2 cross runners so it could slide back and forth. 2 people held the frame stable while a third worked the point across the moving surface. The grinding was faster and more even than hand sharpening on a fixed stone. Ruto named it the angry stone on the first afternoon, because the grinding sound was unpleasant, and the results were alarming. Dega used it without comment. He produced 12 points in the time he would have produced 4. The crossbow took me 2 days to build, and I built only 1. The principle was simple. A short, powerful bow mounted horizontally on a wooden stock, with a carved bone hook that held the string drawn until a trigger released it. The shooter could aim with both eyes, take time, hold the draw without muscle fatigue. The bolt was short and heavy, stabilized by a single split feather. I shot it into a section of old log from 20 meters. The bolt buried itself so deep that Breck had to use his knife to lever it out. He held it up and looked at the depth of the hole and said nothing. Karhan had come outside to sit in the afternoon sun. He was walking more steadily now, the cough almost gone, but still conserving himself. He watched me demonstrate the crossbow twice. When I handed it to him, he turned it over in his hands, studying the mechanism, working the bone trigger with his thumb to feel the action. "This isn't for hunting," he said. "No." He handed it back and said nothing else. That was the extent of his commentary on the matter. We dug 3 new pits in the final 2 days, larger than the animal traps, placed across the main northern approaches, where the terrain funneled movement naturally. Sharpened stakes in the bottom, covered the same way as always. The rattle line moved out to 200 meters on every approach. A full perimeter. Dega worked on the pits without a word of objection. He dug, he sharpened stakes, he helped carry cover material. I watched him from across the site a few times and saw a man who had put down something he'd been carrying and was moving more easily without it. When there is a real threat, the games stop. That was something I had seen on construction sites in emergencies. The fastest way to unify a fractious team was a problem that required everyone. I filed it away. Aine came to my hut that evening when the settlement had gone quiet. She sat down across the cold fire pit from me without invitation, which was how she always arrived, present, not asking permission, treating my space as a place she was allowed to enter. I had stopped finding this presumptuous several visits ago. "You're preparing for war the way a man prepares who has seen wars," she said. I didn't answer. "In my father's tribe, they say you changed after the mammoth." She looked at the crossbow leaning against the hut wall. "My father says a foreign spirit entered your body. He says when the danger passes, he will perform the rite to drive it out." I looked at her. "What do you think?" She considered this with the patience she brought to everything. "I think the spirit question doesn't matter," she said. "Children are alive who wouldn't be. There's meat on the racks in autumn for the first time in 3 winters. The water doesn't kill the young ones anymore." She paused. "Whatever you are, you're useful." "That's not what I asked." She looked at me directly. "I don't know what you are. I know what you've done." Another pause, shorter. "I won't tell my father what I think or what I notice." She stood, brushed grass from her hide, and left. I sat in the dark hut for a while after she was gone, thinking about what she had just offered and what it would eventually cost her with Goro, and what it meant that she had calculated that cost and made the offer anyway. Outside, on the northern tower, someone was on watch in the dark. The rattles sat quiet along the perimeter. 11 bows, 40 arrows, 1 crossbow, 3 pits, and 8 people who had never fought anything but animals. The strangers were 3 days away by Tugu's latest estimate. I picked up the crossbow and worked the trigger mechanism in the dark, feeling for anything that might bind or slip under pressure. It was smooth. It would work. That was the best I could say about any of it. I wasn't asleep when the first rattle went off. I had been lying still in the dark for 2 hours, with the crossbow across my chest, listening to the settlement breathe. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that sharpens sound, and I had been tracking the small noises, the fire settling in the cave, an owl somewhere east of the towers, the wind through the grain field below. The rattle was on the northern line, one cluster of bones, then another 30 meters west, in quick succession. Something large moving fast, not caring about noise anymore. They had crossed the 200-meter line. I was out of the hut before the second rattle finished. The tower signal came almost immediately. Tugu's voice from the northern platform, controlled and carrying. Lights in the trees, many, coming straight. I moved through the settlement in the dark. The positions were already set. We had rehearsed this twice, walking through it in daylight until every person knew their place without thinking. Runa had taken the women and children to the cave at nightfall. The entrance was blocked from inside, with the heavy stones we had staged there 3 days ago. They would not come out until I called the all-clear in daylight. Rudo, East Hill. He was already moving. Dega, West Hill. A shadow detached from near the weapons rack and went without a word. Gorn fell in beside me with 4 of the spearmen, moving toward the south end of the settlement. The false entrance, the most visible point from the northern approach, lit by a small fire I had set there deliberately. The crossbow was in my hands. The quiver of bolts was at my belt, 7 of them, each one checked twice that afternoon. On the central tower, Tugu had 3 torches ready. 1 torch held high meant the threat was left. 2 meant right. 3 meant center, straight ahead, which was what we expected. We took our positions and waited. They came in quietly for 60 people moving through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. I heard them before I saw them. The soft compression of grass underfoot, the occasional scrape of a branch, the particular silence that a group of people make when they are trying not to make sound and are almost succeeding. The settlement's fire cast light 30 meters out from the southern entrance. Beyond that, darkness. I stood at the edge of the light and watched the dark and waited. The first shapes emerged from the tree line, scouts. 4 of them, moving low, spreading out as they entered the open ground. They saw the huts. They saw the fire. They held position and signaled back into the trees, and then the main group came forward. They moved in a loose mass, not organized into any formation, which told me this was not a raiding group with military experience. This was a tribe that fought by overwhelming numbers and aggression, not by tactics. That was the one piece of information I needed most, and I got it in the first 30 seconds of watching them move. The scouts pushed forward into the settlement, past the first 2 huts, heading for the light and the fire at the south entrance where they could see me and Gorn and the spearmen standing. They hit the first pit at a full walk. The sound was specific, a sharp cry, the impact of bodies against the stake-covered bottom, a scrambling and then screaming that the tribe behind them didn't understand yet. 3 men down in the first pit, before the ones behind them could stop. The scouts scattered sideways off the prepared path, and 2 of them found the second pit. More screaming. The mass behind them compressed and stopped. The front ranks unable to see what was happening, the rear ranks pushing forward. In the dark, with screaming ahead and no information, the natural response was to bunch together, which was the worst possible response to archers on high ground. Tugu's 3 torches went up from the central tower. I called it bows. The arrows came from both hills simultaneously. I had timed the angle. Anyone standing in the open ground between the tree line and the pit zone was at roughly equal range from both positions, and the shots came from above and to the sides, which meant the archers on the east hill weren't shooting toward the west hill and the reverse. Clean fields of fire in the dark. The arrows were not all accurate. Archery at night into a moving target at 40 meters was not a controlled exercise. But there were enough of them, spaced correctly, and the enemy was standing still in confusion, and several found their marks. The front of the group broke left and right, searching for cover. Several ran back toward the trees. Others went down into the grass, which was the right tactical response, and which I had not fully planned for. Prone targets in long grass at night were nearly invisible. For 3 minutes, the settlement entrance was chaos, and I held position at the fire, crossbow up, watching for any organized push toward my line. None came. The enemy was dealing with pits and arrows from angles they couldn't identify, and they had no frame of reference for any of it. Then Tugu's single torch went up, threat left, and I looked at the west hill. A group had broken away from the main mass and gone wide, circling the settlement perimeter, looking for a way around the chaos at the front. They had found the west hill and were climbing it. Not many, 8 or 10 by the sound, but climbing fast, and Dega's position was only 4 people. I heard the sounds change on the west hill. The deep thud of thrown stones, the impact of bodies, shouting in a language I mostly didn't know. Then the shouting changed pitch. and I saw the silhouette of someone going over the platform edge. Dega's group was being pushed. I left Gorn with the spearmen and ran. The West Hill was 60 meters from my position. I covered it in the dark using the path I had walked 20 times in daylight, avoiding the 2 ground-level obstacles I had mentally mapped, arriving at the base of the hill in less time than I had thought possible in the dark. I stopped at the base and looked up. The platform was 6 meters above me. Dega and 2 others were still on it. I could see them against the slightly lighter sky, using the platform edge as a barrier, pushing down against people coming up the ladder rungs and the rough face of the structure. 3 of the attackers were on the frame itself, climbing. 1 was almost at the platform level. The crossbow was already drawn. I aimed at the largest shape on the frame, the one nearest the platform, the one who would be over the edge in the next 5 seconds, and released. The bolt hit center mass. The shape came off the frame and fell. The 2 below him stopped climbing. They were looking down at what had fallen, then up at the platform, then out into the dark where the shot had come from, seeing nothing. I was already reloading. Draw the string to the hook. Set the next bolt, raise the stock. The 2 on the frame went down. Fast, not running, descending with purpose, still dangerous but off the structure. From the platform above me, Dega's voice, sharp, commanding, directing his 2 remaining people to push the climbers back. A stone the size of my head went over the edge, and I heard it land. Then another. Then no more climbing sounds. The attackers who had come for the West Hill pulled back into the grass and stopped. Below in the settlement, the main group was retreating. I could tell by the direction of the sounds, moving north, back toward the tree line. Not a rout, not panic running. A deliberate withdrawal, carrying people, supporting their wounded. These were people who had been in bad situations before and knew how to extract from them. I stood at the base of the West Hill and watched the darkness, and did not move until the sounds were gone entirely. The night was quiet for an hour before I called the all clear. Gorn was the first casualty I found. He was sitting at the base of the south entrance fire with his back against a log. His left hand pressed to his right shoulder, an arrow shaft broken off short where it had been snapped against something. His face in the firelight was white and set. When I crouched beside him, he looked at me and said with considerable effort, "Still here." "Yes, you are." I checked the wound. The arrowhead was in the muscle, not deep, no major vessel from the bleeding pattern. It would need the head removed, which was going to hurt significantly, and then packing and rest. He would keep the arm. The second was a young hunter named Pell, 20 years old, one of Rudo's group from the East Hill. He had taken a thrown stone to the side of the head during the descent from the platform, and was unconscious with a swelling above his left ear. His breathing was steady. I moved him to a stable position and stayed with him until I was satisfied the breathing pattern was consistent. By first light, I had a count. 41 people accounted for, 2 unable to fight, 11 bows, 42 arrows remaining. We had used fewer than I'd planned because the fight had ended faster than I'd expected. The huts were untouched. The cave was intact. The grain field was untouched. The drying rack was untouched. The enemy had left 7 people in the pits and on the ground. They had taken the rest of their casualties with them. They had retreated north. Dega found me at the fire while I was eating. He stood for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for him. Then, "You saved my hill. You held it." He looked at the ground between us. "I thought you took power because you wanted power." A pause. "I think differently now." He walked away without waiting for a response. I watched him go and thought about what it costs a man like that to say even that much, and decided it was enough. Tugu came to me at mid-morning. He set a fresh bark sheet in front of me without a word. I looked at it. He had been out since first light, tracking the retreat. The new map showed the withdrawal path, north through the western forest, then northeast following a ridgeline. And at the end of the trail, 2 hours from where we sat, a camp symbol. Tugu's largest camp symbol, the one he used for a permanent or semi-permanent base. Beside it, in his own notation, a mark I had learned meant many, not the standard count marks, a different symbol entirely. The one he used when the number exceeded what his stick could easily hold. "How many?" I said. Tugu was quiet for a moment. "Atho," he said. "There are a lot of them." I sat with that. The group that had come last night, the 40 who had actually attacked, was a scouting force, a forward element sent to test what they were dealing with. The main body was 2 hours away and was large enough that Tugu, who counted everything, had reached for a different symbol rather than try to enumerate. I folded the bark sheet carefully and held it. I looked at the settlement. The huts standing dry and solid, the smoke from the cave where Runa was cooking the morning meal. The grain field turning gold at the bottom of the slope 3 weeks from harvest. The drying rack with its load of fish and meat. The towers on the hills with people on them. 2 years of work. All of it visible from where I was sitting. 40 arrows. 15 people who could fight. A crossbow with 5 bolts remaining. And 2 hours away, a hungry army that had just sent 40 people to test our defenses, and lost 7 of them, and learned everything they needed to know about what we had. They would come back. Not because they were cruel, because they were starving, and they had found a place that wasn't. That was the oldest and most understandable reason for war that existed, and it couldn't be solved by arrows. I sat at the fire and thought about the grain field, and the fish run and the drying rack, and how much food was actually there versus how many people needed it. The math was not what I wanted it to be, but the math was also not finished. There was a variable I hadn't tried yet, the one that didn't require anyone to die. I had one night to figure out if it would work.